Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Oliver Blockland, Senior Conference Producer at Global Investor Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this live web conference on post-Brexit and Mifid 2. On behalf of myself and the team, I'm pleased to see so many of you have joined us here today. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Katten, Muchin, Rosenman UK, for their continued support. In today's 1-hour web conference, we will have Stephen Hanks from the FCA provide a 10-minute presentation, followed by a 5-minute Q&A. Then we'll have a panel discussion of around 40 minutes. And again, we'll have some time for Q&A. We already received a few questions for our panelists. If you wish to ask a question, you can do so by clicking the Q&A button. Do keep sending through your questions for the panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we can by the end of the session. I'd like to thank the speakers and moderator for sharing with us your time and thoughts and some of the topics we'll be discussing today. The session is being recorded and will also be hosted on globalinvestorgroup.com. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Hanks.
Good morning. I'm Stephen Hanks from the Markets Policy Department at the FCA. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Brexit and a little bit about the Mifid review. In terms of Brexit, you will have seen the statement by David Frost, the UK's lead negotiator. The government's aim to complete the negotiations by the end of the year and for the transition period to end at the end of this year. So that's the timetable on which work continues to be done. In terms of financial services, obviously the main thing that was said in the political declaration towards the end of last year on financial services was that both sides would work together to try and make equivalence determinations and that work would be endeavour to conclude assessments by the end of June. At the moment, we are advising the Treasury on equivalence decisions that the UK will make in regards to the EU. So we're across the various regimes in the different dossiers, we're looking at equivalence, particularly importantly, obviously, derivatives trading obligation. We are also helping the government with the information it is having to supply to the EU to enable the EU to make its equivalent determinations of the UK. The EU has sent questions to the UK, and we are now working with the government to help supply answers to those questions. As I said, the timetable for that set in the political declaration is the end of June. We'll have to see how that plays out. In terms of what happens to UK regulation after the end of the transition period, the government had intended to publish a white paper on financial services setting out its high-level strategy. Unfortunately, that has been delayed by the current crisis relating to COVID-19, and therefore it'll be a little bit longer before that sees the light of day. Obviously, one constraint on the UK after the end of transition period, assuming that equivalence has been agreed, is the need to continue to remain equivalent to the EU, although the government has made clear that it thinks that equivalence is based on outcomes rather than having a line-by-line regime which is identical to that of the EU. So that should create some scope for UK's regulatory regime to differ in details, if not in terms of the outcomes that it seeks to achieve. But we're going to have to wait a little bit longer to find out more details of exactly what will be the UK strategy in financial services after the end of the transition period. Turning to the Mifid review, obviously there are various consultations that have been taking place both by ESMA and by the European Commission on that. Deadlines, again, have been extended for those because of COVID-19, although the Commission consultation is going to close in the middle of this month. There have been rumours that the Commission might bring forward some measures for changes to Mifid next month. What we have heard is, possibly that there will be a series of measures, mainly in relation to the Mifid conduct rules, and in particular to issues which have been highlighted over the last couple of months. But that most of the main markets issues will not be dealt with in any package of measures next month, but they will wait till either later this year or possibly into next year. In terms of the changes being looked at, obviously the Mifid transparency regime is a significant part of what ESMA has consulted on. When it comes to derivatives transparency, I think ESMA had two aims in the proposals that it included in its consultation paper. Firstly, was an effort to try and simplify what is a relatively complex regime, simplify it both for firms and for regulators, including ESMA. And also, there was a concern that as a result of the way the regime currently operates, that there has been insufficient transparency. So some of the proposals look at increasing levels of transparency, getting rid of the size specific to the instrument, waiver for pre-trade transparency, and potentially having more real-time transparency of at least prices in post-trade transparency, and possibly one of the options that was tabled was getting rid of the concept of traded on a trading venue and having a broader application of post-trade transparency to all sorts of derivative transactions. Obviously, people will have been looking at those proposals, and I think the issue that was central to the original Mifid negotiations of where you strike the line between transparency and provision of liquidity will continue to be a key issue in the development of proposals to revise Mifid. I think from a UK point of view, we have a lot of sympathy with the view that the regime ought to be simplified, but we have a certain amount of nervousness about potentially some of the proposals and the impact they might have on liquidity. ESMA has also now published its advice to the European Commission on commodity derivative position limits, arguing for a simplification of the regime and focusing on essentially certain key contracts rather than all of the contracts traded on trading venues in Europe. That is something certainly from a UK point of view we would strongly support. In the Commission's consultation paper, it asks some questions around multilaterality and what constitutes a trading venue. There have been various concerns that there are some platforms who are operating in a way that looks like a trading venue, but which is who have not been currently regulated as trading venues. I think in derivatives, I think that's been particularly raised as an issue in relation to the trading of foreign exchange derivatives. I think there the Commission recognises that is quite a difficult issue to deal with, and is interested in views rather than having a firm view of exactly where it wants to go with those proposals at this point in time. Obviously, from a UK perspective, we will not be part of, we will not be bound by the EU version of Mifid beyond the end of this year. We continue to be interested in the European debate, and as I say, potentially looking forward at the UK's own regulatory regime. Some of the responses to ESMA and Commission consultation will be helpful, I think, in helping to shape our own thinking of what might happen to the UK regulatory regime in this area in future. But as I say, at the moment, there isn't a specific timetable for proposals in terms of changes to the UK regulatory regime. I think that will have to emerge over the next 6 to 12 months. That's what I wanted to say in terms of Brexit. Mifid, a relatively brief overview. I'll now hand back to Oliver for questions.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Stephen. We've already had some questions come in. The first one, liquidity has fragmented in Europe with the proliferation of new trading venues. What does this mean for trading firms, and what, if anything, should be done about it?
I think that there is nothing specific that is likely to be done about it, because in a sense, people are allowed to set up venues as long as they meet the requirements in the legislation in order to compete with incumbent venues. So I don't see any specific proposals being put in place to reduce the number of trading venues. I can see that having more trading venues does complicate the life of trading firms. There are more venues potentially to connect to. That's more expensive. But I would have thought that over time, the effects of competition would be to see liquidity aggregate, possibly in fewer venues than we have now. But quite how long that process will take, I don't know.
Okay, another one. ESMA admitted in December that Mifid 2 has failed to reduce the price of market data. Where do we go from here?
I think there are two answers to that question. Obviously, the Mifid review is looking at the issues of data and, to an extent, data costs. There, on the EU side, the main proposal which is being looked at is a consolidated tape. For derivatives, I think mainly the Commission is interested in whether there should be a consolidated tape for derivatives subject to the G20 derivatives trading obligation. But in the UK, we, the FCA, obviously put out a consultation, a call for inputs on market data earlier this year. The timetable for responses, because of the COVID-19 events, has been put back to October, but that asks a wide-ranging series of questions about market data and market data costs. And once we have the responses to that, we will obviously look at them and decide where we want to go next. That work is being led out of our competition area in the FCA. So it might be that the way in which we take that work forward is not just in terms of any potential changes to existing regulations, but also in terms of potential competition remedies. But as I say, we're a long way from that. We need to get responses to call for inputs and to look at them and then decide where we're going to go next.
Okay, and I think we have time for one quick last one. On Monday, the open access rules under Mifid 2 may be pushed back from their July 2020 implementation date. Is open access a lame duck, and what does this mean for the European market more broadly?
I mean, that was a report, I think, in risk of a non-paper being circulated by the current EU presidency about whether the current exemptions for exchange-traded derivatives, where trading venues and CCPs can be exempt from the open access requirements, should be put back by another 2 years. I think potentially what will happen is that, and obviously we are not part of these discussions in the European Council, which is what the non-paper would have been circulated around. Potentially the exemptions would be extended through the amendments to the CRR, and then there would be a reflection in the Mifid review as to whether or not the open access regime should be maintained in Mifid. Not certain exactly where that will end up, but I think it is fair to say that there are relatively few member states who are enthusiastic about the open access provisions, so there must be a possibility in respect of exchange-traded derivatives that they will never actually come into effect.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. We're now going to go on to the panel. Thank you, Stephen.
As my panelists turn on their videos, I will give a brief introduction. As you all are aware, we're going to be focusing on what the world looks like post Brexit and Mifid 2. I mean, Mifid 2 came into effect on January 2018, so most market participants have had a chance to try to adapt, and we want to take a look at what this all means as the UK leaves the EU. I have a great group of panelists. In order not to lose much time, I'll do a very quick introduction to them all. I do want to emphasize that we're going to run through about 5 or 6 questions that are formal questions to the panelists, but you all should be sending in your questions because we do want to have a brief Q&A at the end, and I will be making it clear when that Q&A starts, but feel free to send your questions in. So joining me today are James Stuber, who's European head of market structure at Citigroup, Collery, who's head of trading at Comgest, Hasmita Patel, senior compliance officer at Spectron, and lastly, Heiko Stuber, who's with SIX as the senior proposition manager of financial information. Well, actually, Hasmita, I think I would like to start the first question to you. And that question is, given the UK's departure from the EU, what does that mean for both European regulation and European firms?
I think the biggest concern is how the EU frame will actually work, because I think once the UK leaves the EU, I think a lot of people kind of feel that the UK may be at some form of disadvantage because they won't be engaged in the policy making. So we just feel that how will the UK manage? Because they'll be driven by what the EU are requesting.
James, I think you had an interesting counter argument to that.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. I think that you can look at this in 2 ways. At Citibank, we're a global organisation. We have representations in Europe. We face Baugh as our regulator for our European entity. So, in some respects, we do have a seat at the table to help navigate, help steer some of the regulatory debate and discussion. But I think taking a step back and considering it from a UK perspective, maybe now is the time for us to be thinking about planning our own borough to a certain extent. Given what Stephen has just talked about, clearly we need to be careful not to prejudice our position in respect to equivalence, which we can also talk about in this discussion. But I think it's an interesting time. I think that if you look at the responses to the ESMA consultation that Stephen referred to, that consultation on transparency, the transparency regime, you can already see a big divide between continental Europe and the UK. And none more so is that evidenced than the response from FESI, the Federation of European Security Exchanges, where they are interpreting transparency as more business to be done on lit venues on their markets, which is no surprise from a commercial perspective. But undoubtedly, if that is the direction of travel, then we're going to see, we're going to see the cost of doing business in Europe increasing, and essentially giving the UK, an opportunity to be more competitive in providing financial services. So I think it's a really interesting time, and I think we are perhaps a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of what may or may not be, and we have to be careful as we move forward. But let's take some positives from this, not just the fact that we don't have that seat at the European table. Thank you.
Joe, did you want to add something in terms of, I know it's a very complex issue and we can only kind of take it at a high level, but the shared trading equivalent, I think that's going to be a very important issue. I wondered if you could say a few words on that.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Yeah, as I suppose Stephen pointed out, the end of June and the topic of equivalence is going to be fundamental to this, because, EU investors not being able to access liquidity on EU shares listed in the UK is going to be quite complex. I'm thinking an IAG or a TUI. So we really have to address this. There are positive signs from ESMA. They've come out to say they're going to do the maximum to minimise disruption. So this is very good. Obviously they excluded the GBIs, and that was a very good step in the right direction. So we just have to look at these specific events and keep a close eye, because the key is to help liquidity, not hamper it. So
the next question is sort of related to the first one. The idea in trying to do the transition of having the UK leave the EU and in the transition period, have the deadlines and the delays been long enough, or are there going to be some possible unintended consequences because the timing hasn't been sufficient? So, James, can I ask you to kick that off, please?
Yeah, sure. I think that the delays and the uncertainty has obviously been difficult to manage. We have faced a number of deadlines last year where we thought we might be facing some kind of a cliff edge, particularly around some of the elements that Joe raised there on equivalence and what that may or may not have meant, particularly in terms of how we manage our underlying clients and where they cannot do business in order to fulfill, meet those share trading obligations. But in essence, I think that for our organisation, the mantra has always been, business as usual. And the transition period, the delays have been helpful in readying our business for those changes. I think it's hard to second guess, what those unintended consequences may or may not be. I think that the end of June deadline in terms of those equivalency assessments is important. I think if there is continued uncertainty around equivalence, specifically, I think more so in regards to Europe granting the UK equivalence, I think we could find ourselves heading into a similar scenario come the end of the transition period, where we could be facing some of those cliff edges yet again. My hope and the rhetoric that we've heard from both Stephen, but also the Treasury here in the UK, is that the expected outcome is the UK will be granting EU trading equivalence, which is somewhat an interesting turn of events, but that's the way the regulations work. So that in itself is helpful, but I still think that there will be some outcomes that none of us would necessarily be ready for, and not also trying to navigate the changing liquidity landscape and what that means in terms of fragmentation, further complexity.
Thank you. Hasmita, did you have concern for some of the smaller firms?
Yeah, I did. Yes, as Stephen said, we're gonna. It doesn't appear that there's going to be any delay to the transition period, and that to date is going to be. I think, particularly in this climate and current situation that we are, with the COVID-19, it's certainly going to have a huge impact for firms to try and get their employees out there. Obviously, there's concerns, with trying to avoid spread. We just don't know where we are at the moment. So I think that is the biggest thing that's going to be a stumbling block for certainly the UK. So I think that's an area, and also we talked about once even if we were to go in live, after the transition. Again, just going back to Stephen X, from there's been a lot of questions being raised around firms who look like a trading venue, they speak like a trading, but they're not a trading venue. How it's going to have a huge impact then.
Thank you. I want to get Heiko's views on something, and certainly with the UK leaving the EU, I think we all felt like there was sufficient reporting obligations already under Mifid 2 and EMIR, but now with the UK having their own regulatory regime in addition to the EU, Heiko, what do you think the big challenges are, and what should firms be aware of that they may not already be thinking about?
Yeah, hello, good morning from my side. Hope everybody is healthy. Very good question, actually. We exercised, or we had a look on it, and it seems it's all dependent on the equivalence decision. So, for example, if you have a look on the regulatory reporting requirements, it's dependent on, most of the time, on the data. Data must be available. Is the data standardized? Do we use common unique identifiers? What happens, for example, when the UK leaves the EU? Is the legal entity identifier still an obligation per law? Probably not, but is it being used? Because there are so many interdependencies between the UK and the EU. So it doesn't make sense to go really for a hard, that's my opinion, to go for a hard cut, because there are, as said, there are so many interconnections. And we also talked about the trading venue classification. So what happening there? Because it's very important. If there is equivalence, then it's good. If not, you have to reclassify all these trading venues, and the trading venues themselves need to get prepared, if the trading obligation is still valid under EU, that they build up entities. So there is a huge amount of work on that. It's not only data, it's the processes, it's the political decisions about equivalence. And as you can see, we are talking not only about Mifid in the UK, it's some sort of Mifid. Then you have, for example, also benchmark regulation. We are talking about EU benchmark regulation, but nowadays also about UK benchmark regulation. And as you can see, there are so many dependencies. Hopefully, the synergies will be used in the different jurisdictions.
Yeah, and just as an aside question, do you think there's clarity as to what the reporting obligations will be for branches, EU branches operating in the UK and UK branches operating in the EU? I mean, is that all crystal clear, or are there some complexities there?
To be honest, also my personal opinion, no, it's not clear, because it's so many, or there are so many dependencies on the equivalence decision, because the reporting obligations, what is actually being stated in the regulation. So you have to actually read both worlds. If we are going for the UK post-Brexit, you have also to be considered because a lot of the customers of the investment firms, they are participating in both markets. So there are dependencies on the EU, but as well as also on the UK. So we need to have a close look into what is, from a regulatory perspective, described in the UK, what is described in the EU, will there be changes, and definitely, is there the equivalence being sorted?
Okay, thank you. No, that's it's interesting that the level of responsibility that's being put on these equivalence decisions. That certainly seems to be a common theme that is emerging. I wanted to kind of change the direction a little bit and talk on something that I think from the panelists, there was a view that there had been some good that came out of the changes to the execution and the research and bundling changes within Mifid 2. And I think we can get an interesting buy-side, sell-side discussion going. So with that, Joe, I'd ask you to kick it off, if you would, please, on the buy side.
Yes, certainly. So one of the main positives is initially the RTS 28 and the reporting obligations from our side to certainly show who we're trading with, the top five venues, etc. I mean, there's a lot of complexity to it. Are you a liquidity provider, maker, taker, etc. It's gone a long way to sort of showing that at least you're distributing your flow accordingly. It's helped make sure that there's no sort of allocation to, say, sister companies, etc. So that's been positive, but there's still a bit of way to go, I think, because it doesn't necessarily shift the onus now. I mean, the buy side still need to maintain literally tick level data. They need to look right down to where every fill is coming, store this in a meaningful repository, and use this information to help them evaluate both their brokers and their own trading approaches. I mean, you have to ensure the best possible outcome for your client. It means you have to dive in this deeply. You have to develop core relationships with your counterparts. You have to really look into the data to help you move forward. It's certainly forced, let's say, the sell side to open their doors a lot more. I mean, the days of passing an order to a broker blindly and then receiving your execution at the end of the day are gone, thankfully. It's definitely been a shift to the buy side to pick their own venues, to pick the best algos, to pick the best performance, to measure reversion, to measure that kind of flow. So certainly from our side, it's been fantastic. A nice reduction in com levels as we leverage the broker side's infrastructure, IT, the spends that they have done. It's been fascinating, and just those partnerships get stronger and stronger every day.
James, what about from the sell side? What have you been seeing?
Yeah, look, I think I'd echo a lot of what Joe has said there. I think what's important is that the best execution obligations instill a much more quantitative approach to broker selection in terms of the choice of broker and the choice of strategy, the algorithm that the underlying client, the dealer on the buy side desk is using. And I think that in itself is and has been a big positive. For us to compete on a level is important, and this notion of muscle memory as to why did you give that order to that broker? Well, I've known Steve for 15 years. We're good mates. It kind of doesn't wash, right? So I think we've certainly seen a benefit to our business from those changes. And there are other mechanisms which I think have been beneficial to help the buy-side dealing desk. Thinking here in respect to the use or the greater use of these algo wheels, whereby for some of the more liquid large cap names, maybe smaller size business that can go through a more automated process, where performance dictates to which broker you're going to use, has given the buy-side dealing desk the opportunity to focus more on some of the larger sized business, which again I think has been really helpful. I suppose we shouldn't discount from the fact that this has placed an administrative burden on all of us, and none more so than the buy side, in evidencing best execution and also producing best execution reports, the RTS 28 reports, albeit only on an annual basis. But there has been some market pushback, some advocacy around whether or not some of the reporting obligations are necessary or actually are adding any value. So we just need to keep that in mind as well.
Hasmita, I think you've been seeing some changes due to the Mifid 2 best execution rules. Can you share some insight on that, please?
Yeah, I guess just going back to the best execution reports, it has put a lot of focus on certainly the broker side. At the end of the day, it's really what the client wants, and you start to question. I mean, also there's been question around that there's all this data out there, not particularly for best execution, but then you've got all your transparency information. How useful is it? How and is it reasonable? I mean, there's so much data, and I do get it from the investor's point of view. The whole purpose of it is it allows the consumer to assess the best price out there. But when there's so much data out there, it's managing that data and trying to assess how to consume that data, and does it actually make sense to them in the end?
And I'm going to use what I consider to be a question that seems to be the favorite old chestnut that's asked at most FOW conferences, and that has to do with the emergence of the RFQ and SI trading venues and the impact on liquidity. So does anybody want to kick that off first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, look, I think that a couple of things, and maybe selfishly just focusing on equities, there seems to be maybe not necessarily a lack of understanding, but maybe a lack of interpretation here, in that actually the systematic internalizer regime was put in place post Mifid 1, so certainly not a new construct in that respect. And where we have seen, and this is somewhat of a controversial discussion debate, but where we have seen that growth in what is reported as SI business, a large portion of that business is repurposed OTC business that was prior to Mifid 2 and prior to the share trading obligation, was what we would have reported as over-the-counter business. So what you're seeing from an SI perspective is a rebranding of that liquidity. And unfortunately, because of perhaps a lack of, I suppose, specific guidance in how the market reports SI business, as everybody will be aware, that there's certain flows, certain SI business that is perhaps over-reported or incorrectly reported, which is inflating the SI number in itself. But again, the positive from Mifid 2 is one of transparency. And a lot of this SI business was internalized. It was transacted on what we define as broker crossing networks pre-Mifid 2, so matching client-to-client business that is no longer permissible under Mifid 2. And some of that business is now getting externalized, some to SI market makers, and where we can continue to transact client flow, that's client to principals, that's client business matching with what we have on our balance sheet. Now that all has to be pre-trade transparent, which it previously wasn't, and we continue to fulfill our post-trade reporting obligations. So I think we just need to be mindful that this is not necessarily a new phenomenon, it's not new flow. We have to be mindful that some of this business may be over-reported, which we're trying to address as an industry. And maybe just briefly to finish on RFQ, again, it's interesting that there is some rhetoric, particularly in those responses to the ESMA consultation, again, as to how much business has been transacted on these venues. Now, specifically, RFQ for kind of my world has been very much focused, geared towards ETFs. ETFs have evolved in a very different way to the underlying cash equity market. There are pros and cons to an RFQ model. And I would argue that the cash equity market has sold for trading in block size using different mechanisms, and RFQs are not necessary in that respect, although there are initiatives around evolving the ETF model into the equity space for shares. But again, these are platforms that have now had to be repurposed as MTFs under the new regulatory framework, but were well established prior to Mifid 2.
Joe, I believe you had some views on this as well.
Yeah, no, I mean that's an excellent point by James. This isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. The houses have been gearing up for this for a long time. They're well used to dealing with this in terms of flow, and they've made a huge investment in organizing this, meeting their obligations, and trying to make it comfortable and easy for their clients, which ultimately helps us with our clients. So again, I really have to push the point that it's imperative on the buy side to create these partnerships with these houses, because I mean, you've got central risk books, you've got Delta One, you've got all sorts of topics going on inside these big houses, and particularly a Citigroup. I mean, that's what we're looking at right now. And they're willing to sit down with us and talk about how they deal their flow, how they do it, without necessarily giving away the full secret sauce, I guess, because that's important. But to kind of, they've wanted to open their doors and share that information. So it's crucial that we learn that, understand that, are comfortable with it, and I mean, because you hear a lot of stuff, you did a lot of panels, and maybe, are they internalizing, the profitable flow from SIs and potentially externalizing toxic flow to the markets? I mean, you hear a lot of rumors, and I mean, I think it's important just to remember that particularly the SI regime, it does contribute to price formation. It helps transparency, and there has been a huge investment of capital from these firms to create this construct to help the market. So yeah, important just to keep all this in mind.
Yeah, and so do people generally think that the not so new RFQ and SIs have increased or decreased market liquidity?
Well, certainly from our side, it's made doing business far easier. Quality of execution has definitely improved with SIs, also LISs and frequent batch auctions. I mean, it's never been sort of cleaner and easier for certainly for us to access liquidity. And then, as James mentioned earlier, that old relationship is kind of been in the more illiquid assets now, where we're forced to sort of see where can we get stuff done? What house covers what place where you could actually find the other side of a trade. That's where the relationship side comes in. But in the more developed stuff, it's been excellent, and yeah, long may it continue.
I think it's probably just worth again thinking about the liquidity that those SIs are providing, particularly the bank SIs. When you consider the average trade size on a lit venue, let's call it out at 5,000 euros. It's probably south of that, to be fair. If you're trying to work a large institutional block order that is in many multiples of that, in many multiples, €1 million, $1 million blocks, you need to be able to manage the cost, and that's both the indirect and direct costs, meaning the market impact of trading such a large order. And it's really those SIs, those half a dozen, let's say, global banks that can manage that. And that's really important when you think about investor protection and you think about best execution. And you have to measure both those direct and those indirect costs. And again, just to close off some of the other rhetoric that we hear out there, this is not business that those lit venues can readily consume. Okay, those primary markets have not really innovated around this to offer an alternative for trading that kind of block business. And furthermore, this is business that when we consume it as an SI, we still have to
unwind that position. Yeah, so we're still trading on these lit venues. It's not that we're taking liquidity away as an SI. It's all part of the wider ecosystem. And I think we all have to remember that, and providing, and again, not speaking as an SI, but thinking about it in the broader context, providing optionality and choice of execution for different types of flow, different size of business is crucial and important, a functioning marketplace. I think that sometimes gets a little bit lost in the noise as well.
Yeah, that's a huge point. I suppose it's sort of moved the onus to the lit, as James says, to innovate. I mean, talk of an EU best bid and offer, but I mean, definitely some houses are starting to consider the lit venues as perhaps one of the more toxic venues, frequently attacked by HTFs, etc. So yes, they need to take this as an opportunity to raise the game and move with the innovation that's already out there.
Before we get to the Q&A session, and you guys have kind of been already kind of hinting that in contrast to what the market may have been saying before the advent of Mifid 2, that actually there have been some very good positive things that have come from Mifid 2. So I'd like for each one of you to say very, very briefly, so we have time for Q&As, what you think a real positive has been from Mifid 2 and what a negative might have been. So Heiko, we haven't heard from you in a bit. Why don't I start with you?
Okay, good. To be honest, I don't comment on regulations if they are bad or good. But what is obvious, actually, everybody was complaining from the stakeholders about, oh God, regulatory burden, etc. But the implementation goes very well, for sure. First of all, you have to bring your processes being compliant. Then you take care about the data, etc. That was typically what we figured out during the implementation of Mifid 2, because the data questions came by mid of 2018, not at the beginning, because the processes were very important. But as you can see, the feedback, and if you have a look on the consultation paper provided by ESMA regarding market data costs and consolidated tape, etc., it seems, yeah, there is still room for improvement, but the market is prepared, is taking care of it. A lot of processes have to be adjusted, but it was already there, implemented, triggered by Mifid 1. And now we are talking about Mifid 2, and there will be probably in the future Mifid 3, whatsoever, but definitely, to be honest, all positive so far. There are still a lot of things to do, but as said, it was mentioned earlier, transparency was actually increasing. So I think it's a good point. And yeah, let's move on. Thank you.
Hasmita, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I kind of sort of agree with those points. I mean, transparency was certainly a key area where what the drive for Mifid 2 was. And yes, it was a very painful and costly, very costly for all the firms to comply with Mifid 2. When I think about, how firms were, talking with legal lawyers, external consultants, you've got new technology that they had to embrace. But yeah, we've gone through Mifid 2, and now, as I agree, we just need to move on. It can only get better. Yes, there is still room for improvement, and I think the biggest areas is looking at your data again. And that's always, it's just because the complexity of the data and the volume of data. But that, as I said, the challenging times, but if we've been through Mifid 2, the rest could be a piece of cake. Let's wait and see.
Yeah, I suppose definitely to reiterate what I mentioned earlier, it's definitely positive has been the improved transparency, and secondly, the really forcing the buy side to stand by every choice they make. Why do I choose a low touch over a high touch? Why do I do this? Why am I paying X commission? You have to absolutely stand by every choice you made. You need to have your quality of execution. You need to have your broker reviews. You need to be able to stand in front of your client or an auditor or the regulator and say, this is my choice. This is the system I have in place. These are the this is the best performer. This is why. This is how. This is my database. This is my access. It's been excellent to do that, and it's important that every firm does that. I suppose on the negative side, unfortunately, their aim was to get the volume towards the lit venues. The market responded and with innovation, and it didn't go that way. It went another direction. So I suppose they need to address that now in the next one.
Thank you. And James?
Yeah, I haven't really been left with much, have I? But I'll give it a go. Yeah, look, I think just to reiterate, the best execution obligations, I think, has been a key positive. Let's not lose sight of the fact that this should be about investor protection, and it should be about providing the client with the best outcomes. And if we don't lose sight of that, then that's clearly a key benefit that has come from regulatory change. I think on the negative side, we've talked at length about the complexity, the cost. I'm not sure that it can get better or will get better. I think it's going to be a hard couple of years, particularly in light of Brexit and how we align, how we consider some of those data challenges that have been discussed on the call. So I think for now we keep evolving, and we see where it takes us, so long as we don't lose sight of our pension funds and our end investors.
Well, thank you all, my excellent panelists. That concludes the formal part of the presentation, and so now we'll be taking Q&A from the audience. So please send in your questions, and we've had a few come in advance, and so I'd like to kick off with one. And this is sort of a cross-border, so we have to think about the United States here a little bit. But the question is, how can international firms reconcile the fact that it seems to be that very different regulatory approaches are being taken within the EU and UK versus what's going on in the US? And I take that to mean, slightly now in the US, it seems, given the current political conditions in the United States, there seems to be more of a relaxing of regulations. And in contrast, there's a lot of uncertainty, clearly, in the EU, but also possibly a tightening. So does anybody want to kind of dive in on how you're trying to adjust to this?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. I think there are a number of factors at the sort of the macro level. We have to adopt and adapt to different regulatory regimes on a global basis, whether that's in Tokyo, whether that's in New York or here in Europe. There's no doubt, and without going into all the details, under the current political regime in the US, they've taken more of a view that markets should be self-regulating, and having been to a number of events and conferences in the US, I guess maybe more selfishly, it feels quite refreshing to have representatives from the SEC talking about regulation, and those representatives being industry practitioners. So being from the sell side or the buy side and taking that step into regulation, into politics, into the SEC. And I think that we suffer a little bit here in Europe, where perhaps there is too much politicking going on. Unfortunately, none more so than at this point in time due to Brexit, which is somewhat understandable. But I think we have to take that into consideration. Otherwise, I think one of the key impacts when we think about the extraterritoriality of regulation, and specifically Mifid 2, we haven't really gone into the details on unbundling, on research unbundling. And that's been quite hard, particularly for the buy side to manage on a global basis, those institutional buy side clients, whereby having to pay direct for research in one region and having to consider a more bundled model in another has been a challenge. Although again in the US there has been some leniency in that respect.
We can move on to another one. I think Stephen Hanks addressed this a little bit, but I would be interested, as well as the audience, in the panel's view on basically what does the Mifid 2 review look like, or how is it going to progress when the UK is not going to be involved in the ultimate review. I mean, I think we got some insights from Stephen Hanks that obviously the UK would be looking to all that input and the direction that the EU decides to go, but that there might be certainly scope to do something different in the UK, and also perhaps even the review itself won't be the same without the input from the UK. Do you all have any views on that? Or
yeah, look, I think that we talked about it a little bit earlier. It's a difficult time to sort of second guess. I think that a lot of the discussions ongoing in the UK are very mindful of, as I said earlier, of prejudice. So I think it's quite hard for us to comment or to go into any real detail about that. But there's no doubt that we as UK, I should say, need to consider the good elements and how we position ourselves as a company in the financial market.
Well, I think we have time for one final question, and this is coming live from the audience. And do I have any panelists that are involved in the crypto world? Because a specific question as to what will be the conditions for licensing of cryptocurrency exchanges. I mean, from my point of view, that will be something that's going to have to evolve, because it was about last summer, that's where you had the FCA and ESMA and the other European regulators all sort of post their general guidance as to what would be require regulation and what wouldn't. And even though there was a lot of harmonization on those points, I think with time we might see some deviation. So I think at this point it would be a little premature, unless any of you disagree with me, to try to give a firm answer to that. But with that, I think we're exactly 1 minute over. And so I'd like to thank all of my panelists for this excellent discussion and presentation. And thank you very much to the audience for listening.